In the stillness of the desert night, as the stars shimmered like divine lanterns above the sands of Badr, a silence reigned that was not peace, but the deep breath before the storm. The year was 2 and destiny stood on the cusp of one of the most defining moments in Islamic history. The humble yet resolute army of the Prophet Muhammad, barely numbering 313, stood against the pride and might of the Quraysh, a force thrice their size, armed to the teeth with arrogance and steel. Among those 313 was a man whose presence alone could shift the gravity of any battlefield, Hazrat Umar ibn Al-Khattab, RA, the lion-hearted companion of the Prophet. Known for his unshakable resolve, piercing intellect, and awe-inspiring stature, Umar RA was not just a warrior. He was a man carved from principle and lit by the fire of Iman. The tension on the battlefield was palpable. The Prophet, wrapped in a white mantle, raised his hands toward the heavens, whispering fervent supplications that poured like rivers into the night sky. "O Allah, if this group is destroyed, you will not be worshipped on earth." Tears streamed down his blessed face. This was not just a battle for survival, it was a war for truth. Hazrat Umar RA, standing beside the Prophet, watched him pray with such intensity that his heart trembled. Never before had he seen Rasulullah so immersed in dua, as if the sky itself would crack open in response. Umar RA approached him gently and said, "Ya Rasulullah, your Lord will not abandon you. He will fulfill his promise." Soon, the drums of war began to beat. The Quraysh army, proud and fierce, marched forward. Their banners fluttered in the wind like ominous shadows. The Muslims, armed with faith more than weapons, tightened their ranks. Hazrat Umar RA looked at the faces of his fellow believers, some young boys barely into manhood, others former slaves, merchants and shepherds, but all with hearts ablaze with conviction. Then came the duels, honor-bound tradition in Arabian warfare. From the Quraysh came out their champions, Utbah, Shaybah, and Walid. 3 towering warriors, drenched in arrogance. The Prophet sent forward his own, Hazrat Hamza RA, Hazrat Ali RA, and Hazrat Ubaidah RA. The clash of swords rang out like thunder, and in a flurry of divine courage, the Muslims prevailed. But this was only the beginning. As the armies charged, Hazrat Umar RA surged forward like a storm unchained. With each swing of his sword, he struck not just flesh but the false pride of Jahiliyyah. He fought with the strength of a man who had once been the enemy of Islam, but now stood as its protector. His roars echoed across the dunes. His eyes blazed not with rage, but with a clarity of purpose that few could fathom. In the chaos of battle, Umar RA spotted one of the most bitter enemies of Islam, Abu Jahl, the pharaoh of this ummah. The sight of him stirred old memories, of pain, of the torture of early Muslims, of arrogance that mocked the message of Allah. But it was not Umar RA who reached him first. 2 young Ansari boys, barely in their teens, had already set their eyes on him. Umar RA later narrated this moment with awe. "I saw them move with such ferocity, such determination, that I was humbled. These were not children, they were lions." Abu Jahl fell, not to the sword of a mighty warrior, but to the courage of the next generation of believers. Yet Umar's sword did not rest. He pressed forward, each step driven by the weight of responsibility, the love of the Prophet, and the promise of a just world. At one point, Umar RA came upon a wounded soldier from the Quraysh. The man looked up at him, defiant yet broken. Umar recognized him, an old friend from his days before Islam. Their eyes met, both of them knowing that time had made strangers of them. The man sneered and said, "So this is what you've become, Umar? A follower of the man you once wanted to kill." Umar RA raised his sword, but paused. In that moment, there was a silence that seemed to stretch beyond time. He saw not an enemy, but a soul lost in arrogance. He said, "Yes, I once walked in darkness. But now, I walk in light. You still have time to choose." But the man spat in reply. Umar RA, knowing mercy must never come at the cost of justice, finished what needed to be done. There was no room left for those who waged war on the truth. As the day wore on, The sands of Badr ran red with the blood of both martyrs and enemies. The tide turned swiftly, and victory, miraculous, overwhelming, divine, was granted to the believers. But amidst the celebration, Umar, R.A., remained reflective. He stood at the edge of the field, watching the sun dip behind the dunes, his sword lowered, his heart full. He remembered the beginning, how far he had come. From the man who once left his house with the sword to kill the Prophet, to the man who now fought by his side. Badr was not just a battlefield, it was a mirror of transformation, of divine destiny, of souls reforged in the fire of faith. And yet, just as the dust began to settle and the bodies were counted, a call came from the Prophet's tent. Something had happened. The call from the Prophet's tent carried an urgency that sliced through the hum of the aftermath. The companions gathered near the shaded enclosure where Rasulullah sat, his face serene yet firm, a subtle gravity in his expression that signaled something beyond the physical victory just won. Hazrat Umar RA approached with quiet intensity, brushing dust from his garments, the weight of the day's bloodshed still heavy on his shoulders. His eyes searched the Prophet's face, seeking understanding. Inside the tent lay something more potent than weapons, a message, a decision, perhaps a revelation. The Prophet had received news regarding the prisoners of war taken from the Quraysh ranks. Among them were prominent men, those who had persecuted Muslims in Mecca, insulted the messenger, and vowed the destruction of Islam. Now, they sat chained and humbled, their arrogance cracked by divine intervention. The companions awaited guidance. The Prophet looked to Abu Bakr, R.A., whose soft features bore the wisdom of age and compassion. "What do you think should be done with the prisoners, Abu Bakr?" he asked gently. Abu Bakr, R.A., hesitated only briefly, then said, "Ya Rasulullah, they are our relatives, our own people. Perhaps we may take ransom and let them go. It may be that Allah guides them." Then the Prophet turned to Umar, R.A., and the atmosphere subtly shifted. There was a reason he was asked second. Umar's nature was forged differently. Where Abu Bakr saw mercy, Umar saw justice. With eyes dark and intense, Umar, R.A., responded, "Ya Rasulullah, these are the enemies of Allah and His Messenger. They have spilled the blood of the innocent and brought torment upon the believers. Allow us to strike their necks, each by his closest relative. Let Ali deal with Aqil, let me deal with mine, and let Hamza take care of Abbas. Show no softness to those who showed no mercy." The tent fell into silence. It was not brutality Umar, R.A., spoke with, it was clarity, a warrior's understanding that mercy must be balanced by deterrence, or it becomes weakness. The Prophet listened deeply. His heart inclined, as always, toward compassion, but revelation would soon descend to guide the moment. The decision was made to accept ransom, to spare the lives of the prisoners, for now. Umar, R.A., did not argue. He submitted, as always, to the Prophet's judgment, but something in his heart remained unsettled. He could feel it. This was not over. And indeed, within hours, verses of the Quran were revealed, gently rebuking the decision to accept ransom. It is not for a prophet to have captives of war, until he has thoroughly subdued the land. Surah Al-Anfal, 8 hours 67 minutes. The words fell like lightning. The Prophet summoned Umar, R.A., again, his eyes misted. "O Umar," he said, "I could almost see the punishment descending if not for Allah's mercy." Umar, R.A., wept, not out of pride that his judgment had aligned with revelation, but from the fear that even a moment of divergence could invoke divine consequence. This was the burden of prophecy, the weight of being the first Ummah built upon both compassion and consequence. Umar, R.A., had not rejoiced, he had trembled. The prisoners, meanwhile, were kept in Medina under watch. Among them was Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's own uncle, a man who had been forced into battle against his will, yet had still stood with the Quraysh. Umar, R.A., was tasked with watching over him for a night. When he entered the place where Abbas was bound, Umar sat quietly nearby, speaking little. Abbas, restless and uneasy, shifted against his ropes. "Umar," he said, his voice low, Do you find satisfaction seeing me like this? Umar R.A. looked at him, his voice controlled, but laced with unwavering resolve. This is not about satisfaction. It is about truth. You stood against the messenger of Allah. I do not rejoice in your humiliation, Abbas. But I do stand firm in the justice of your capture. That night, Abbas groaned in discomfort from the tightness of the ropes. The Prophet heard him from his own quarters and, overwhelmed with compassion, rose and personally loosened them. Umar R.A. witnessed this the next day and said, Ya Rasulallah, are you troubled because of your uncle's discomfort? Yet I had to see my own uncle Hamza bleeding in the sands of Badr? The Prophet looked at him with sorrow, not anger, and Umar R.A. understood. The Prophet's heart bore wounds of mercy. Umar's bore scars of sacrifice. Both were valid. Both necessary. Days passed, and one by one, the prisoners were released upon payment of ransom or other acts of goodwill. Some, like Zayd ibn al-Dathina, would later embrace Islam. The seeds planted in mercy, though controversial in the eyes of Umar R.A., began to sprout. But it was in the quiet aftermath, once the bodies had been buried and Medina had begun to exhale the tension of war, that Umar R.A. felt the full gravity of what had passed. He went to the Prophet one evening as the sun painted the horizon gold. Ya Rasulallah, he said, Badr was a miracle, but also a trial. Allah tested us with the sword, and some hearts may have wavered. The Prophet looked at him long, then nodded. Yes, Umar. And greater tests are yet to come. Umar R.A. understood. This was not a single battle. It was the beginning of a lifetime of struggle, a war not only fought with swords but with decisions, with patience, with the steady burden of leadership. It was only a few weeks later that news reached Medina. Another caravan, laden with wealth, was approaching. The Quraysh, humiliated by Badr, were preparing for revenge. Whispers of Uhud had begun. But in that interim, something strange happened. One evening, Umar R.A. was walking near the Prophet's mosque when he noticed a child sitting quietly outside. The boy looked no older than 10, barefoot, eyes swollen with recent tears. Umar R.A. sat beside him. What troubles you, boy? He asked. The child looked up. My father was in the army of Quraysh. He didn't return from Badr. Umar R.A. stiffened. And your mother? She weeps every night. We are alone in Medina now. Umar R.A. felt a pull in his chest. This was not the battlefield. This was its consequence. A child caught between truth and bloodlines. He brought the boy to his home, gave him food, and later went to the Prophet. There are children like this in Medina, Ya Rasulallah. What of them? The Prophet responded with a softness that seemed to draw the air itself to stillness. We are not just builders of a state, Umar. We are healers of hearts. Let no child of Mecca weep in our city without comfort. Let no woman mourn without support. That too is jihad. And so, Umar R.A., the fierce lion of Badr, began a quieter mission. He visited homes, checked on orphans, ensured the hungry were fed, and spoke to those who had once been his enemies but now sat silently within the fold of the Islamic State. This was the Umar most did not know. Not just the warrior or the ruler, but the watchman of the people's pain. Yet even as peace reigned on the surface, the storm beneath brewed louder. Medina's Jews, once protected by treaty, grew wary of Islam's rising power. Hypocrites within the Muslim ranks whispered discord. And in Mecca, Abu Sufyan plotted vengeance. The Prophet called a meeting of the senior companions. Umar R.A., always direct, advised preparation. They will not rest until they have attempted to erase their shame. We must anticipate the next strike. And indeed, messengers brought word, the Quraysh were amassing another army. This time, larger, better equipped, and driven by revenge. Uhud would soon eclipse Badr. But before the swords could cross again, Umar R.A. had another challenge, one of the heart. One of the captives released after Badr, a man named Sa'id, returned to Mecca with something different in his soul. He had tasted the Muslims' mercy, seen the Prophet up close. He began to question the lies he'd grown up with. Weeks later, Sarid slipped out of Mecca and returned to Medina, not as a prisoner, but as a believer. He came to Umar RA, knelt before him, and said, "I once cursed your name. Now I take your hand in faith." Umar RA lifted him to his feet. "The only name that matters is La ilaha illallah. You are our brother now." That night, under a moon washed in silver light, Umar RA stood in prayer longer than usual. He whispered verses from Surah Al-Anfal, the very chapter that chronicled Badr. His tears touched his beard. He had once been an enemy of Islam. Now he stood as its pillar. And in his heart, he knew, Badr was not just a battle won. It was a door opened. And behind that door, the future of this ummah awaited. The days following Badr became a quiet storm of reflection for Hazrat Umar RA. The sands had been soaked in struggle, the sky had watched angels descend, and history had been carved into the very soil beneath Medina. But Badr was more than a military victory. For Umar RA, it was a divine marker, the moment where destiny and sacrifice embraced in the fire of belief. He would often sit outside the Prophet's mosque late into the night, his sword now sheathed, his eyes fixed on the stars. They reminded him of that night before the battle, when fear was high but faith was higher. He remembered how the Prophet had raised his hands until his cloak slipped from his shoulders, pleading not for triumph, but for the preservation of truth. And Allah had answered. Umar RA carried that moment like a flame in his chest. He knew that battles were not just fought with blades but with hearts, with discipline, with truth over ego. The battlefield had been cleansed, but the deeper war, the war for the soul of humanity, had only begun. He looked around at the faces of his fellow companions. Ali RA, young and brilliant with courage. Bilal RA, once crushed by chains, now lifted by the adhan. Hamza RA, the lion of Allah, whose bravery had echoed across Badr like thunder. And above all, Rasulullah, calm, luminous, the pivot of all change. Umar RA saw in them not just warriors, but men transformed by purpose. In the hearts of many, Umar RA remained a man of steel, a sword of justice. But those closest to him began to understand the layers that defined him. In public, he was thunder. In solitude, he was wind, silent, watchful, always moving toward Allah. He would speak little of his personal pain, yet the memory of the companions who fell at Badr never left him. Men like Mijah, the freed slave of Umar RA himself, who had taken an arrow and whispered the kalima with his last breath. These were not statistics of war, they were eternal stars in the sky of Islam. Umar RA once stood before the graves of the Badr martyrs and said, "By Allah, you have preceded us, and we, too, will follow. But may Allah never let us betray what you died for." There was no crowd that day, no oration meant for effect. Just sand, sacrifice, and sincerity. Years later, as Islam expanded like sunrise across the horizons of Arabia, and Umar RA stood as the second Khalifa, ruling an empire from the same Medina that once slept in fear, he would still speak of Badr, not as a general recalling glory, but as a servant remembering a divine favor. He would tell his governors, his army commanders, his scholars, "Do not forget where we came from. We were a people unknown, and Allah gave us honor through Islam. If we seek honor in anything else, we will be humiliated." And though Umar RA would command legions, conquer empires, and shatter the thrones of Persian and Roman kings, his voice would always soften when he spoke of the early days, of hunger, of prayer, of hiding in Dar al-Arqam, of the whip marks on Bilal's back, of the Quran recited in secret caves, and of that dawn when 313 believers stood in Badr with nothing but truth in their hands and Allah in their hearts. He often said, "If all the deeds of my life were placed on one side of the scale, and the day of Badr on the other, I would not hesitate to choose Badr. For it was there that the soul of the Ummah was born." Even as Khalifa, when the great victories poured in, Jerusalem, Egypt, Persia, Umar RA never allowed arrogance to poison the roots of Islam. He walked barefoot into conquered cities, slept on the sand under trees, and reminded his commanders of Badr. We won that day not because we were many, but because we were sincere. Once, in a gathering filled with scholars and warriors, Umar RA paused the conversation and said, "Tell me, who among you was at Badr?" The few hands that rose were not always the most prominent names, yet Umar's eyes shone with respect. "You," he said, "are our foundation. Allah looked upon you and forgave you. Never forget the day the heavens themselves moved for your sake." He preserved the names of every martyr from that day, reciting them in his prayers, weeping over them in solitude. He knew that the heart of Islam beat with the blood shed on that field. And though his own sword had struck many on that day, it was his humility that remained most victorious. There was a night when Umar RA stood alone on a rooftop, looking out across the city that once trembled at the thought of Quraysh's revenge. The moon bathed Medina in soft silver light. In the distance, a child laughed. The streets were safe, the people secure. This peace, Umar thought, had been bought not with power, but with the purity of those who stood at Badr. He raised his hands, as the Prophet once did, and whispered, "O Allah, do not let us falter where they stood firm. Do not let us forget the price of your mercy." That night, he did not sleep. He walked the alleys of Medina in his usual patrol, dressed simply, the leader of the Ummah yet indistinguishable from its poorest citizen. He brought food to a widow, lifted water for a traveler, and smiled at an orphan. No fanfare. No titles. Just Umar ibn Al-Khattab, servant of Allah, student of Muhammad, guardian of the legacy of Badr. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all. That Badr was not merely a battle. It was a blueprint. A blueprint for every believer to understand that victory lies not in numbers or might, but in truth, unity, and trust in Allah. That leadership is not about glory, but about service. That every drop of sweat in the cause of justice, every moment spent in standing up for what is right, is a continuation of Badr. Even now, centuries later, when the name of Umar RA is mentioned, it echoes with the weight of that field. Not because he was flawless, but because he was sincere. Not because he never stumbled, but because he never let pride keep him down. He rose, again and again, with the remembrance of Badr burning in his soul like an eternal flame. So remember this, when you stand for truth while the world mocks you, when you hold fast to your principles while others sell theirs for gold, when you choose the harder right over the easier wrong, you are walking in the footsteps of Badr, and in the shadows of those who gave everything so that the light of Islam would never be extinguished. Hazrat Umar RA, the sword of Islam, the pillar of justice, and the shadow of truth, carried that legacy till his final breath. And so must we.